Running a business shouldn't feel like a juggling act. One app for accounting, another for inventory, one more for sales, and somehow they never work together. Or you can use Odoo, one fully integrated platform with all the business applications you need: CRM, inventory, accounting, marketing, and more, all working together seamlessly. Stop juggling software and get back to growing your business. Try Odoo for free at odoo.com. That's ODOO.com.
This is brought to you by EternalAffairsMedia.com. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share if you love this content. Dig in and visit our website for much more. The White Coat Confidence Game: How Dr. Fauci and Big Pharma Turned a Pandemic into the Greatest Transfer of Wealth in Human History. When history renders its verdict on the COVID-19 era, it won't be kind. What unfolded between 2020 and 2023 wasn't a public health response. It was a staggering excise in manufacturer consent orchestrated by a medical pharmaceutical complex that had spent decades positioning itself for exactly this moment. At the center of it all stood one man, elevated to secular sainthood by a compliant media apparatus, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the highest-paid government employee in American history, who parlayed a bad virus into unprecedented authoritarian control over 330 million people's lives. And the whole thing was built on sin. The man behind the curtain. Let's start with what the media never mentions. Anthony Fauci is not a clinician, not a virologist, and not a vaccine scientist. He's a bureaucrat. A very wealthy, very connected bureaucrat who spent 38 years running NIAID like a personal fiefdom while accumulating a net worth north of $12 million on a government salary, a mathematical impossibility without some creative accounting or the kind of conflicts of interest that would land anyone else in federal prison. Fauci's immunity from scrutiny was absolute. When Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance, the very organization Fauci's NIAID funded to the tune of millions, was conducting gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology that may well have created the pandemic, Fauci lied about it. Under oath before Congress, he denied funding gain-of-function research. Internal emails later proved otherwise. No consequences, no perjury charges. Just a media chorus insisting he was America's doctor. The man personally signed off on beagle puppy experiments in Tunisia where dogs had their vocal cords severed and their heads locked in mesh cages filled with sandflies. When the White Coat Waste Project exposed this, the public was horrified. Fauci's response? Dismiss, deflect, deny. His defenders called it necessary science. Necessary for whom? The gold standard evidence that wasn't. The entire public health apparatus rested on a single premise: trust the science. But what science exactly? The COVID vaccines were rushed through in under a year, shattering every previous record using a Pharma platform that had never before been approved for human use. The clinical trials were truncated. The placebo groups were unblinded and vaccinated within months, making long-term safety comparisons impossible. This wasn't an oversight, it was the plan. When independent researchers requested the raw clinical trial data from Pfizer, the DDA asked the federal judge for permission to release just 500 pages per month, a timeline stretched into the year 2096 before full disclosure. Let that sink in. The agency charged with protecting public health argued in federal court that Americans don't deserve to see the data behind mandatory injections until most of them are dead. The CCS own VAERS database, which even the agency acknowledges captures only an estimated 1% of actual adverse events, has logged over 1.5 million reports of post-vaccination injuries and deaths: myocarditis in young men, blood clots, Guillain-Barré syndrome, sudden deaths in athletes. The mainstream response to each report was always the same: correlation doesn't equal causation, followed by zero investigation. Meanwhile, the CCS own website now acknowledges what heterodox voices had been saying for decades: the claim that vaccines do not cause autism is not evidence-based because the study simply never ruled it out. If they lied about that for 30 years, what else are they lying about? The treatment suppression scandal. This is where the Scamdemic label earns its name. When the pandemic hit, the playbook was already written. The goal was never to find the most effective treatments, it was to clear the field for a novel patent-protected vaccine that could generate hundreds of billions in revenue. Every cheap, widely available therapeutic had to be destroyed. Hydroxychloroquine, the first casualty. HU was a 65-year-old generic drug with an extraordinary safety profile used by millions for malaria and lupus. Early observational studies, including Didier Raoult's work in France, showed remarkably positive results. The response from the medical establishment wasn't scientific inquiry, it was total information warfare. The Lancet published a fraudulent paper based on Surgisuri's completely fabricated data claiming HU increased mortality. The paper was retracted, but only after the WHO had already halted HU trials based on it. The damage was done. HU was branded a horse dewormer by a media that somehow forgot the drug had been on the WHO's list of essential medicines for decades. The truth? HU works as a zinc alkaphor. It shuttles zinc into cells where zinc inhibits viral replication. The mechanism is straightforward biochemistry, but understanding that would require acknowledging that a cheap generic might work, and that was simply not an acceptable outcome. Ivermectin, the people's medicine. Then came ivermectin, a Nobel Prize-winning drug with over 4 billion doses administered globally and a safety profile so robust it's distributed to entire African villages without individual prescriptions. The ILSS protocols, Pierre Corey's congressional testimony, and the comprehensive data aggregated at C19 early.org all pointed to dramatic effectiveness when used early. The establishment's counteroffensive was breathtaking in its dishonesty. "You're taking horse paste" became the mantra, conveniently ignoring that the drug won the Nobel Prize in Human Medicine. Major media outlets ran stories about people poisoning themselves with veterinary formulations while systematically suppressing the fact that 85 studies showed positive outcomes. When the New England Journal of Medicine published a trial showing no benefit, critics noted it used ivermectin for only 3 days, a laughably inadequate duration. When the Together trial claimed negative results, the statistical manipulations required to reach that conclusion would fail any undergraduate methods course. The DES response to Americans seeking information about ivermectin for COVID was a tweet reading, "You are not a horse, you are not a cow." Seriously, y'all, stop it. This from the same agency that approved OxyContin. The remdesivir racket. Meanwhile, remdesivir, a $3 120 per course antiviral from Gilead Sciences that showed no mortality benefit in the WHO's own Solidarity trial, received emergency use authorization and became standard of care. A drug that doesn't save lives but costs thousands per patient was embraced. A drug that costs pennies and shows strong signal was ridiculed. The pattern is so obvious it barely counts as analysis. The revolving door and the capture. None of this is conspiracy. It's institutional architecture. Fauci's NIAID is embedded in a system where regulators routinely leave government to accept seven-figure positions at the very companies they were supposedly regulating. Scientists collect royalties on patents for drugs they help approve. DDA advisory committee members vote on products made by companies that fund their research. The numbers are staggering but underreported. The employee collected over $100 million in royalties from pharmaceutical companies between 2010 and 2020 alone. Fauci himself held partial ownership of patents related to vaccine technology. When he appeared on television to urge universal vaccination, was he speaking as a public health official or as a stakeholder? The Pfizer COVID vaccine alone generated over $37 billion in revenue in 2021, the single most profitable product in pharmaceutical history. Moderna, a company that had never brought a product to market, suddenly became worth over $100 billion. Their executives became overnight billionaires through perfectly timed stock sales. The pandemic wasn't a crisis for these companies. It was the business opportunity of a lifetime. A propaganda apparatus? The media's role cannot be overstated. Every dissenting voice, whether a Nobel laureate, a tenured professor, or a practicing physician, was smeared as a conspiracy theorist, anti-vaxxer, or purveyor of misinformation. Social media platforms, coordinated with federal agencies, systematically deplatformed doctors who dared to question the narrative. The term misinformation itself is a masterpiece of linguistic manipulation. It falsely conflates the sharing of information with the endorsement of truth, and it places unaccountable bureaucrats and Silicon Valley trust and safety teams in the position of arbitrating what is true. The Ministry of Information would blush. YouTube removed videos of doctors testifying about successful early treatment protocols. Twitter banned Alex Berenson for pointing out that the vaccines didn't prevent transmission, a claim that later became official CDC policy. Facebook's fact-checkers were almost uniformly drawn from establishment media outlets and academic institutions funded by the pharmaceutical industry. The censorship wasn't about protecting public health. It was about protecting the narrative long enough for the money to clear. The children who paid the price? Perhaps the most damning chapter of the scamdemic is what was done to children. Despite COVID pose a near zero risk to healthy children, survival rates exceeding 99.99%, schools were closed for over a year in many jurisdictions. Children were masked for 8 hours a day, their developing brains deprived of the facial expressions essential for social and emotional development. They were isolated from friends, from extended family, from normal life. The learning loss was catastrophic. The mental health crisis among adolescents, already trending poorly, exploded into a full-blown emergency. Suicide attempts among teenage girls rose sharply. Eating disorders surged. The developmental consequences for the youngest children, who miss critical windows for speech and social development, will unfold for decades. And for what? The vaccines were pushed on children despite minimal risk from the disease and no long-term safety data. Myocarditis rates in young males post-vaccination exceeded the risk of COVID hospitalization in the same demographic. The risk-benefit calculus was inverted, and the people who pointed this out were silenced. The CDC now acknowledges what many parents have been reporting, that the vaccine autism question was never properly studied, that the blanket denials were institutionally convenient rather than scientifically rigorous. How many parents were gaslit when they reported their children regressing after vaccination? How many were told it was just a coincidence? Follow the money? At every level, the pandemic response served financial interests over public health. The CARES Act funneled hundreds of billions to hospital systems that were paid premium rates for COVID-coded patients, creating a perverse incentive to classify this as COVID-related even when the virus was incidental. Nursing homes in several states were required to accept COVID-positive patients, with predictable and deadly results. Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson received complete legal immunity from vaccine injury claims. If a vaccine harms you or your child, you cannot sue. You can apply to the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, a bureaucratic black hole that has paid out a tiny fraction of claims. The companies keep the profits. The taxpayers assume the liability. This isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. The Biden administration's 2021 vaccine mandate, forcing millions of workers to choose between an experimental medical procedure and their livelihoods, would have been unthinkable in any previous era. Federal employee, military personnel, healthcare workers, and private sector employee at large companies were all given the same ultimatum: get the shot or lose your job. The Supreme Court eventually struck down the OSHA mandate, but not before thousands of careers were destroyed. The reckoning. The tide has turned. The CCS quiet revision of its vaccine autism position, the growing acknowledgement of treatment suppression, the release of previously censored data, the political shifts that brought RSA Jr. to HHS under the MAHA initiative. The public is no longer buying what the establishment is selling. But the reckoning requires more than just acknowledgement of past wrongs. It requires full release of all clinical trial data, not in 2096 but immediately. Honest investigation of vaccine injuries with compensation for those harmed. Congressional accountability for Fauci and others who lied under oath and suppressed treatments. An end to the revolving door between regulatory agencies and the industries they regulate. Restoration of medical freedom. The principle that no American should be forced to accept a medical intervention against their will. The scamdemic wasn't just about COVID. It was a low-fire exercise in biosecurity authoritarianism, a proof of concept for how quickly a compliant population can be convinced to surrender their freedoms, their livelihoods, and their children's futures in exchange for the illusion of safety. Dr. Fauci retired in December 2022 with a full pension, his reputation burnished by a fawning media, his conflicts of interest unexamined, his lies unpunished. The pharmaceutical companies kept their profits and their immunity. The censored doctors are still fighting to have their licenses and livelihoods restored. The question isn't whether the scamdemic happened. The question is whether we learn from it before the next one. Because there will be a next one. The same people are still in charge. The same incentives are still in place. The same media apparatus is still waiting for its marching orders. The only variable that's changed is that more Americans are awake now than were in 2020. And that, in the end, may be the one thing the architects of the scamdemic couldn't control. The truth has a way of getting out, no matter how many fact-checkers you deploy against it. This was brought to you by EternalAffairsMedia.com. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share if you love this content. Dig in and visit our website for much more.
Avoiding your unfinished home projects because you're not sure where to start? Thumbtack knows homes, so you don't have to. Don't know the difference between matte paint finish and satin? Or what that clunking sound from your dryer is? With Thumbtack, you don't have to be a home pro. You just have to hire one. You can hire top-rated pros, see price estimates, and read reviews, all on the app. Download today.